As we begin, as I said, I have thought long and hard about how to start this lecture. The responsibility of speaking about this particular moment in time is very huge. And I have had two questions. The first one is, where do I begin? I could start by telling you that Kenya was colonized by Britain, first as a protectorate and then as a colony. But you already know this. In fact, you live this reality every single day of your lives. I could also start by telling you that the police system in Kenya is deeply rooted in colonial history and colonialism. But again, you already know this, and that is why you're here. The history that you were taught in school, the history that I was taught, that most of us were taught, was a recitation of facts and figures and dates. That is not what we're here to do today. Today we are here to talk about human experience, and we are here to answer the question, how? How did this system come to be? How has it been sustained for so long? And how do we imagine a future outside of it? The second question that I had when I was preparing this lecture was, how do I want you guys to feel? Do I want you guys to leave here feeling dejected and sad, or fearful, or angry? And so, dear friends, this is an exercise in understanding police brutality, the history of it, but it is also an exercise in fighting against it. My job today as a historian is to guide you through a very vast and rocky landscape of time. We are starting in 1898, a time that most of us cannot picture. Some things will be hard, and some things will be painful. I started by asking, how do I want you guys to feel? I don't know. We will leave from the same place, but we'll most likely end up in different destinations, and that's okay. So let's see what we can do, yeah? Slides are up. Perfect. We will begin in an unlikely place. Next slide, please. So just to give you a landscape of what's happening, when you see a black slide, that one is for imagination, okay? I'm serious. I want you guys to imagine the world that is presented in front of you. As I said, this is not a history for facts and figures or dates. We're interested in human experience. And so we'll begin in an unlikely place. Wengi wetu tunajua Mekatilili, tunamjua Koitalel, tunamjua Wayaki Wahinga. These people have come to occupy their place in Kenyan history as heroes, sometimes even mythical figures. But I want us just for a brief moment to imagine them as children. I am Mekatilili, I am Koitalel, as young adults who are growing up hearing about prophecies from the generation before us. Prophecies that are told of a long fire spitting snake coming through their lands. Prophecies of pale strangers who look like butterflies and whose blood you can actually see through their skin. This is the world that they grew up carrying, the prophecies that they were given, either as children and young adults, we don't really know. But the truth is, the world that their forefathers had prepared for them and their foremothers had warned them about, they were never prepared physically for what they were told psychologically mattered. Yet, when the fire-spitting snake and the pale butterfly-looking strangers arrived, they fought. They uprooted rail tracks, they refused to work, they raided stores, and they confronted these people head-on. Maybe they were scared, maybe they were brave, you don't know. But I look at them as a generation of the frostlight. They are a generation on the front line of hopeless. They did it anyway.
And so I start this lecture very deliberately here. Because to understand colonialism, we need to understand their world. And we need to understand their experience. So this lecture is divided into 4 parts. When I was looking at the origins of police brutality in Kenya, I narrowed it down to 4 things that really shaped the terrain of why is the policing system in this country so damn deep. First thing is race. The other thing is labor. The other thing is trade. And the last one is geography. Yeah? So I need you to forget everything you've been told about colonialism. That's for the civilized mission. I'm happy to release or state the advantages of colonialism. And the army. Yeah? So forget that colonialism was about spreading Christianity. That was about bringing the people of darkness into the light. That was the cover story. I'm afraid that the truth is far less glamorous and chivalrous than that. Above all else, colonial music all around the world was about one day profit. It was about commerce, it was about extraction and control. Kenya was no exception. In the 1890s, as the British Empire is expanding into East Africa, the governments had no impetus to invest fully in a colony. So what they did is that they outsourced this thing called colonialism. They set a private company, a commercial company with commercial interests. Go see what you can find, go see what you can go. This company was known as the Imperial British East Africa Companies. Essentially, for the people who work in tech here, this is what we would call conquest as a service. The Imperial British East African Company is sent here to look at the question of trade. But what is the one thing that you need to exert control? Force. They come in here to trade, they set up trading posts in Mombasa, and begin to set up trading posts far into the interior, following the routes of the caravans. As they set up these trading posts, they need to protect them, so that they're not disturbed by the natives, and so that people are not stealing their thing. A police force, or at least a part of a police force, is NETA. That is where, ladies and gentlemen, the story of policing in NETA essentially begins. It does not begin with justice. It does not begin with protection of communal interests. It begins with the enforcement of commerce. The first police station is set up in Mombasa. It's a trading port, and one of the biggest along the East African coast. But around the same time, something else has happened. So this is 1890, right? Something else is happening in Mombasa. Ships are coming in fast and heavy with steel, with timber, with machinery. Alongside, arriving in these ships is also thousands of laborers from India. Let's build the most important weapon in Britain conquest of East Africa. What is this? Correct. But the railway needed more than steel and timber. It needed men, it needed man-hour. Long before the engine ran, the goods to use the railway, to build the railway, to conduct the surveys for the railway were carried on the backs of men. So porterage, in a sense, became one of the colony's first major demands for labor. They needed men to carry things into the interior. These men were working in very difficult conditions. They were exhausted, no food, very little water, very little pay. And so out of defiance and also to seek respite, many of them begin to desert their posts. So they just disappear, or they leave at a certain town and they're like missing every day. But you need them, right? You need them to build this railway. You need them to secure your trading posts. You need them to carry your goods. And so the administration at the time comes up with regulations for porters. If a porter is found to have deserted and is later on found, he can be fined, he can be whisked, and he can be jailed. And who are the enforcers for this? the headmen of the caravans, the administrators of the trading posts, but also these so-called policers. And so this is the beginning of policing in this region, in this country. Essentially, it was not law enforcement. It was labor enforcement. Yeah? And so I started by saying that there are 4 things that shape policing in Kenya. The first one, we talk about trade. The other thing is labor, and trade and labor are kind of separated. So we started this journey in 1898. Here we are, it turns 25. 100 years are now built. It's easy to speak about colonialism as a single event. Yeah, time condenses being bizarre way. But ladies and gentlemen, being colonized is not a one step. It's a process. The machinery of colonialism is very slow, it's very deliberate, and it's very fruitful. And so we speak about words like protectorate, colony, emergency, as if they're very neat and clean breaks in time. They're not. And the question I present to you essentially today is, how is one colonized? Like, how does the process actually happen? You don't wake up and you're automatically colonized, right? It's a series of many small things. And so in this session, I'm going to talk about laws, particularly labor laws. We've talked about trade from a British perspective and how the police force was sent to protect these very interests, but putting together a group of armed men and saying, these are police, mean nothing to a culture that does not experience or navigates justice in this way. Importance irrelevant. And so to give the police legitimacy, you need 2 things. You need a visible force, but you also need frameworks for this force to operate, and frameworks that you can enforce in the mind of the people that you colonize. So let's call these frameworks the invisible force. And these are laws and legislations. There's a very interesting thing that happens in 1900. And we're going to be talking about what are called the palm wine ordinances. The British didn't introduce trade in the region. They found trade, right? You were trading with each other locally. We had established trading markets outside of the country, Zanzibar, and far along other coasts of the world. But one of the most lucrative local trade, especially along the coast, was the coconut palm economy, dominated primarily by the Vitikena and specifically by the Rapai. Yeah. They cultivated palms for products like makuti, but the main product was wine. It's enjoyment. Here's a thought. Let's start this here. But this was more than subsistence. And this presented a very direct threat to a colonial government that is trying to implement a system of taxation. They're saying you need to pay hard tax, you need to pay poll tax, and you can only pay us in cash. And who has the cash? Exactly. So an economy that is thriving outside the boundaries of British implemented currency is a threat automatically to this whole system. And so for colonial officials, a self-reliant African was a problem. Because how do you expect me to come and join your porter system or be a porter to carry heavy goods on my back for little pay when I can harvest my coconuts, I make my palm wine, I sell it, I sell it with my children, I sell my yacht. So they had to disrupt this in one way or another. Their response was very swift. In 1900, the palm wine ordinances are passed. Essentially, they make it illegal to sell wine without a license. And this license is issued by the district collector. A 1906 article by the South African Standard read, "The drinking class has the lowest class of natives in Mombasa district in its grip." Public intoxication became the pretext for police crackdowns. This marked one of the first major internal policing roles that the police force had in Kenya. Pay attention to this because this whole thing about public intoxication and Africans are rowdy in the streets comes back later. Just pay attention to it. And within a few years, these regulations are spreading not just from the coast, but as far inland as Machakos.
You kind of make
Wine, as we call it, power wine or local brews. And if you do, you have to go to the district commissioner. So that's a first ordinance that I think really plays a part in how the colonial system is bringing Africans into the fold of colonialism. As I said, you don't wake up and you're colonized. There are many things that happen in twists. The second thing that we need to pay attention to, particularly around the laws, are what we call the village headman ordinance. The British ruled by the Reds, and in the Reds, who ruled? But what does that actually mean in practice? If we zoom out kidogo tutoke Mombasa, now 1901, the railway has reached Kisumu, and they've also implemented hard tax and full tax to the mandatory things. So here's where the concept of indirect rule comes into play. This is a law that gives colonial administrators the power to hand select and appoint African chiefs or headmen. These headmen become the bridge between the colonial state and the village. But it was a one-way bridge, essentially. Their job was not to represent their people. It was to collect taxes, round up laborers, enforce orders, and report any defiance. And how do you collect these taxes? How do you round up people? Again, the use of force. So the African headmen, let's call them headmen, can devise a labels, go along. But they have their own form of policing within the villages. They appoint their friends, their crew, to become the force that then they use to collect taxes and to institute this system. For the British, it was perfect. It was cheap. It was efficient. And largely, the hands you made clean. They didn't have to do the dirty work. And so this village headman ordinance is very important because it sets a blueprint for local governance in Kenya for decades to come. And it also embeds a hierarchy within communities of power. So we talked about the laws that really shape colonial policing systems. And you might be wondering, like, what does it have to do with brutality? In my understanding, everything. Because when you look at the Kenyan policing system, it is much more of a culture than it is a system. And for cultures to exist, they are refined and they are shaped by different forces, but they also take a lot of time to end up the way they are. So these are a series of laws that happen. And there are some, again, 1906, Mastered and Servers Ordinance. This comes up again. And it basically gives the European settlers, the farmers, leeway to abuse squatters on their farm. It basically said that if an African has a problem with their employer, the African can only pursue justice through the courts. But if a European settler has a problem with an African employee, they can punish them on this home. So that's another ordinance from 1906. You have between 1898 and 1920, you have a series of ordinances that are being passed. They are passed under the pretext of labor and controlling labor, but really they are there to control African movements and to enforce a policing system in which violence is normalized. The country to 1920 with the Fande, which many of us know, many of us have heard. But the Kipande is not just a system of trackies. It is essentially a system of control. Its role is not just identification but surveillance. Here, chiefs, police, and employers could quickly determine who had abandoned or deserted their post, forgotten to sign up for a job, and it leads to arrests and fine significant. So by 1920, Kenya is no longer a protectorate, it is now an official colony. And the Kenya police as an institution is formally institutionalized. its mission set in stone. It existed to protect commerce, to enforce labor and discipline, and to crush African agency. Its roots are trade, and its tools are coercion. Its authorities basically racial subjugation also. So now we have a black slide. Close your eyes. Next. So I use these black slides as intermissions because again, we want to understand not just history, we want to understand human experience. So we started in 1898. The Kipage is essentially passed in 1919, 1920, and now we're 1922. A large crowd of nearly 10,000 people, mostly women, gathers around Central Police Station in Nairobi. They gather to demand the release of Harry Dokuks, and the protests are the culmination of frustrations and grievances over high taxation, unlawful arrests, the soap familiar, and growing economic disparities under British colonial goal. They start with prayers, and then new relations, and by the end of the day, dead bodies are scrawled across the streets. To fully understand this moment, which culminated in one of Kenya's earliest mass killings, one must situate themselves in the Nairobi of 1922, a city that is primarily structured around the exploitation of indigenous African labor. On one side of Central Police Station, wealthy European settlers sit on the balconies of white-only hotels like Norfolk, watching throngs of Africans walking past them as they head to the protest. Despite being a minority, the entire city's infrastructure, I'm talking roads, amenities, utilities, are built to serve their needs. On the other side, groups of African men and women from various parts of the country march together. They have abandoned their exploitative jobs to occupy a city that is not built for them, trespassing on lands taken from them. Many have traveled from as far as Kenya. As the crowd waits in anticipation for the news of Harry Duku's release, a group of men chosen to negotiate with the colonial administrators announced that, "Hey, Duku akuti leo. Takuja amengojea chai." And they urge the crowds to peacefully disperse and return home. Suddenly, a lone woman, Andy, pushes her way to the front. She strips naked and she shouts, "Take my dress and give me your couch." You men are cowards. What are you waiting for? Our leader is in there. Let's go get him. This woman is Mudoni Yajiro. She's a woman pushed to the edge, in pain, and leading an unbearable life and an exploitative stakes. Her cry resonates with many other women who begin to push forward towards the gates of Central Police Station. The police are taken aback and unprepared for the reaction again. They start firing indiscriminately as a crowd. The settlers who are dining at the Norfolk Hotel also join in opening fire. The crowd scatters, but in the aftermath of the shooting, many bodies lie like years of the crowd, including Yajiro. So I found about, particularly in this protest, imagining Yajiro's body outside Central Police Station in a very similar way to, I think, the image of David Shege's body with the flag and your worst bones. It's etched in our minds, right? And so I use this particular protest as a mirror to reflect that particular moment in time. And so that's 1922. The next stage we go is between 1920 and 1950. That's the next chapter of our story. I told you that the police force essentially was also shaped by the geography of the country. And so this chapter is called Uneven Geographies and the Policing of Politics, not the politics of Okay. Intentional, guys. Intentional. By the 1920s, policing was concentrated in the so-called civilized zone. Basically, what this means is that the police force was only serving White Highland and major urban centers such as Nairobi, Nakuru, and Eldoret, which are also white-dominated areas. Yeah. Here, the Kenya police is operating with increased visibility. Their job is to detect crime, but also to make sure that these places are accommodative and preserve the illusion of order in modernity. At this time, most communities have been pushed towards we call reserves, right? Naskia reserves, yes. So you have Kisi reserves, Amba reserves, like, and then again, structured according to community. But here, there's no Kenya police. That is what we call the tribal police. The tribal police is an improvised force of locally recruited men who are again under the authority of the chiefs at the district commissioner. So here we see basically
It's a direct line between.
Remember the PH Headman Ordinance that gives this African selected chiefs the power to select their own force? This is basically a continuation and a formalization of that. Wait until I tell you what the tribal police became or take this. So the authority is essentially based on like ad hoc arbitrary, decision of the chiefs of the district commissioners they work for. This tribal police equally trained, and they're often there just to collect taxes and to patrol. In the rural, I'm calling rural, what people call the reserves, these are essentially unpoliced zones outside of the state. So the state is basically saying, the Kenya police, the formal force, stays in White Highlands, urban areas, but reserves manage your own security. We see this again in the 1950s when the Home Guard force essentially becomes formalized during the mandates. So this fragmented system created two phases of colonial policing. In settler towns, a force that was modeled on British ideals of order, due process, and in African territories, a brutal apparatus of indirect rule. So again, we're seeing in the 1910s. But another thing comes to place, and I think geography is an interesting thing to look at here because in 1925, we also have what are called the vagrancy
Ordinances.
Na sasa hizi ndo zinasema you can't be in the street Italy, I flee. You essentially criminalize someone's existence. Again, that is geography shaping police because vagrancy ordinances are primarily implemented within urban areas. But another thing is also happened towards the 1950s to the 1930s and the 1950s. And we have a lot of political associations, trade unionism that is growing, that is being formalized. Tunakumbuka Kavirondo Taxpayers Association. Also, that's named so interesting. Taxpayers Association, yes. But between 1920 and 1950, all these political associations were coming out. And this is why I talk about the policing of politics. Because now you have other branches of the police that are being institutionalized and formalized specifically for political intelligence. You have the CID, you have special branch. This is the era in which they primarily come in formation. Initially, they are said to focus on crime detection, but their mandate gradually shifts to encompass what they're calling political intelligence. Recording speeches, having informers, looking at movements of political activists under the guise of public security. So we are heading fast and steady for the 1950s.
What is happening is also in the late 1940s.
In the European settler farms, something is spreading. What you want to be, there's an oath. You need to take this oath, and this oath is to fight for your country. And so oathing is also happening at the same time. And there's a great sense that both resistance from a militant and a non-militant perspective is happening not just in urban areas, but in rural areas as well. Next slide, please. Time for imagination. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. So in 1950, there's a huge strike in Nairobi. It's called the Nairobi Jebel strike, but I really because you have just use a name for May 1950s. So one of the largest strikes against the colonial governments across the country. Leaders of the East Africa Trade Union, Makan Singh and Fred Kupai, have been arrested for operating an unregistered union. An act that was a truth, part of a broader crackdown. The arrests are not taken lightly. They trigger a massive response. By the next afternoon, the city grinds to a halt as thousands of workers walk off their jobs. Crowds gather, roads are empty, and women are helping to sustain the strike through organizing food and supplies. The same day, 17th May 1950, a bonfire ignites on Nairobi River in the map between Pumwani and Sharumoyo. By May 18, there are general strikes in Kisumu, Kakamega, Mombasa, Thika, among other places. The strike spread further over the following days. 750 African railway employees walk out. 1,000 workers from Bata Shoe Factory walk out. Employees at Isili Airport, the Royal Air Force walk out, and various other government establishments. The government strikes back with full force. Raids, armored vehicles, I was actually a picture tickets in Pogatais, and tear gas sweeps through the city. Reclusama is the fragrance of change. Over 300 people are arrested. Employers issue ultimatums and slash cages. But for 9 days, 9 whole days, this strike holds it. This solidarity shook the colonial order to the core. Yeah. Hey. And we're in May 1950, right? Next slide, please. You will not really what happened less than a month later. Now, if you come up with anything for today, it's that the Public Order Act is perhaps one of the most formative legislation in curtailing people's rights to protest and congregate in this country. It is also used as a blunt pretext for brutality, for arrests, for detention. But what I find interesting is that less than a month after this general strike, this is when the Public Order comes into place. Public Order Act of 1950 in June. But what does it essentially say? It requires that protesters issue a notice. It requires that protesters issue a notice of at least 3 days to the police, of which the police can. Yes. We know where this is from, right? This is familiar for most of us in the news. Last week, there's a headline this week. So just, oh my God, last week, there was a headline saying the police commissioner has acknowledged that she has received notice. It comes directly from this act. Okay. So this enacted in 1950, and it gives basically the state a blank check, because the language in it is so vague. Yeah, they can disperse protests, they can survey entire communities because it has phrases like likely to cause a breach of peace. It has other phrases like unlawful assembly, meaning like virtually any public expression of discontent can be interpreted as a threat. Yeah. And so this is 1950. 2 years after this, Romeo is in his car, driving down somewhere against the valley, and it's assassinated by the one up. What happens next?
Emergency.
What does this actually mean? So this chapter is called, because to meet the Empire's Rise Back. What does a state of emergency mean? What do you think it means? What has it?
Curfew.
Movement, right? I'll just spend a bit of time here, the state of emergency, because it really marks a turning point in colonial repression. And I don't think things have ever been better since the siege. Like, it's been worse for us. If anything, I think we've perpetually been in and out of a state of emergency since the state of emergency. But we'll get there. What does a state of emergency actually mean? Fundamentally, it means that normal legal protections, even the little that you had in a Chukurio, the government grants itself extraordinary powers, such as detention without trial, curfews, censorship, forced relocations. It basically said that anything is justified to suppress the rebellion. What this looked like in practice, partly, two main things. As I said, arrest without warrants. You could arrest any person committing any act of intimidation or violence. It also allows the government to detain suspected individuals indefinitely without trial. But it also imposes severe restrictions on movements, curfews, criminalization. Mama is proscribed essentially as a terrorist organization. And it was a terrorist organization until 2008. Let me tell you, until Kibaki came not to power, this law that testified about the terrorist organization was in place for almost 60 years. But what does being a member of a terrorist organization means? It means that if you are found guilty or in association with this, you can essentially be executed. So here there's also an element of death penalty. So yeah. But I really think we should also look at how the nature of policing changes during the fudges. But before you have the Kenya police, you have the tribal police, right? During the emergency, a third element, evolves, but also a third element is introduced. You have the Kenya police, who remain the official law enforcement body. Their role expands to arrests, sweeping arrests, crackdowns, and the administration of detention camps. But remember the tribal police? Essentially, this also forms the foundation of the Home Guard units, which are made up primarily of African loyalists, operating within villages, serving both as surveillance agents and armed enforcers. And then you have a very third, this one breaks my down, still was it? A third element that comes up during the emergency, which is called the Kenya Police Reserve. And these are basically white settlers. Some of them are in the army, some of them are just them. But they formed this thing called the Kenya Police Reserve, and it functions as a semi-military force. They have broad license to kill, to interrogate, to intimidate, often without any accountability whatsoever. The whole period is also very interesting because one of the things that the emergence institutes is the forced prioritization of communities that are perceived as being the hotbed of Mapao. So this was the Kikuyu and Ubiru. The estimated figures are that 1.5 million people are pushing concentrated villages, primarily women and children. And the Home Guard unit is very, very instrumental in kind of policing these villages. And the rates of have rampant sexual abuse. Women are being forced to work extremely long hours. Whereas in the detention camps, detention camps also become spaces of like mass torture, mass killings, forced labor. Detention camps are a whole other thing. Yes? But by the end of the emergency, the numbers are staggering. And these are also put-out data. 1,000 people have been executed by the state, sentenced to death. 150,000 or so have passed through detention camps, mostly adult men. More than 20,000 have been killed, and 1.5 million are villages. The state of emergency is very important because it doesn't just crush the rebellion, it re-engineered the architecture of controlling care. And it leaves a legacy of trauma, surveillance, and authoritarianism that he is still experiencing today. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I've basically taken you through the 1890s to the 1950s through a system of policing that is shaped by race, that is shaped by geography, that is shaped by trade. And the other one was? Labor. So we're basically seeing how all these forces are coming together to create a system of society that is normalized as institution. And so the next section is a big difference. This is not a lecture. The lecture changes here. We enter his last slide. This is imagination time. For the next 4 slides. He was thinking about how to praise, how to look at Kenya after independence. And the sad thing is that the roots of today's police violence trace back to the very legal and administrative and racial systems I've just discussed. And after independence, many were adapted and absorbed into the architecture of a Kenyan state. So even though Kipande laws are not in place, iko pia ikiako. Vagrancy laws were repealed, but loitering and idleness is still a crime, which is a sign of a failing society, that you have to prove your right to exist. And emergency regulations may no longer be in effect, but detention without trial, abductions, disappearances are still common tactics used by the crime duty. After independence, the tribal police became the AP. That's what so that's my idea. But here I also want to ask you a question around what is the function of history, essentially. What is the very real functional understanding of history? I think it's to use it as a tool to navigate the present and to give us a basis and a grounding to ask the right questions, not just to ourselves, but of each other as well. And so this, as we promised, the lecture changes from here because this session is around where one ends, the other begins. You're looking really as what happens after independence, but what I've done is that I've made it a juxtaposition of say different things from different times. So we're playing with time a bit. It's not chronological. But how do we visualize and how do we really bear witness to the fact that a lot of this is continuing? So the first photo is men being transported in the state of emergency to a screening center. The second photo is men be transported to Adala airstrip in 1984, where they would later be massacred during what is called the Wagala massacre. What I've done in this section is that I've also juxtaposed this with quotes and reflections from different canons that speak to these different moments, yeah? We cannot in good conscience stand back as a country and watch our most fundamental institutions morph into machinery for orchestrating and concealing crimes, concealing criminal atrocities against the people across the country that are struggling. The shame. The just for our high priestess, but in going back to the previous photos, next to the state of emergency, during the Wagala massacre, we are still seeing state institutions become machinery for orchestrating violence against the people. So this is a photo of a detention camp. It's Central Kenya in Nyeri. This is how it's the remnants of it. Barbed wire on the windows, and it is also juxtaposed with a photograph of the 9 detention centers. Still. Exactly. So what we're seeing here is that even the infrastructure in a metaphorical sense, I think the word infrastructure is the brick and mortar of the colonial state is still replicated here. This next quote is from Andaliasa. I hope you can read it. I can't. Yeah. This one I've had to do. And it's a photo of a colonial officer standing at gunpoint over many Kariobangi whose houses are being searched. Their hands are raised because they're suspected of being Promal. And it's also juxtaposed by a screen grab from Karimado's video when, since recently, when he was on a protest and he met a couple of protesters, comrades, who were cornered by the police at that point again. And instead of saying, like, "Lari kitu acha tutauriwa." So that juxtaposition for me is also very interesting. So this is a quote from Bellow Kimati in one of the letters that he wrote to the British. It says, "We are not savages or murderers, as the British continue to claim. We know what we are doing and we know what is best for our people." They usually cross out the British because we put in such a song. So, ladies and gentlemen, very